Welcome everyone to the deep dive. Really glad you could join us today. We've got, well, I think it's a genuinely profound exploration lined up. We're diving into something with, gosh, almost 2 millennia of history behind it. Theology, spiritual practice, it's all woven into the enduring legacy of the traditional Latin Mass. And for this deep dive, our main source is www.epistles.online. It's a fantastic resource, actually, for Catholics looking for a, let's say, balanced view. Yeah, the author really tries to navigate that space between, modernism and maybe ultra-traditionalism. And through his work, he's really confronting some big challenges to the faith. Things like clericalism, liberalism, modernism, basically forms of evil he sees fueling this crisis of faith we hear about. Definitely check out www.epistles.online for the full picture, all the details, and subscribe to the Catholic Epistles podcast too. Okay, let's unpack this.
Absolutely. And what's so fascinating, you see this in the epistles.online material, is how a sacred rite like this can, well, it evolves, sure, it gets standardized, but then it faces these huge reforms and still inspires just intense devotion, intense discussion for, like you said, almost 2,000 years. It's remarkable. So our mission today, for you listening, is to really trace that history. We want to pinpoint the key moments, understand the deep theological meaning behind the Latin Mass, and appreciate how it nourished souls, right? And then look at where things stand today, the current situation with its celebration. It's about understanding tradition, really, and how it holds up against modern challenges.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we should start right at the beginning, go way back to the earliest days of the Church. Because, before the Latin Mass, as we sort of picture it, the Church, especially in Rome, was mostly Greek-speaking. But then you get this really pivotal decision during the time of Pope Victor I. That's what, late 2nd century, 189 to 199 AD. And he makes the call to change the Church's official language, in Rome at least, from Greek to Latin. Sounds simple maybe, but it was huge, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely huge. More than just language. The source material suggests this wasn't just, swapping words. It was a fundamental step. It started to kind of subtly center the Church's identity around Rome, around the Latin tradition. Before that, things were more varied locally. But adopting Latin, well, it began solidifying that unique Western Church character. It really laid the groundwork for a more unified expression of faith later on. And think about the practical side. Priests needing new texts, the people adjusting. It set the stage for centuries of worship, how millions experience God.
Well, that's a great point about centralization. And this language shift, it was really just a start, like a longer process, wasn't it? Organizing, standardizing the liturgy itself. Because if you jump forward a few centuries, you land in the time of Pope Gregory the Great, late 6th, early 7th century, 590 to 604. Another key player.
A massive player. Gregory's time was really about refinement, about systematizing things. Before him, even in the Latin West, there was still quite a bit of regional liturgical variety. Gregory took really decisive steps. He organized the Roman Mass liturgy, brought more cohesion, and crucially, this involved standardizing the canon of the Mass, that core Eucharistic prayer, the unchanging heart of it, making sure that was consistent, theologically sound, reverent, wherever the Roman Rite was used. And it wasn't just words, he also championed Gregorian Chant. Now, he didn't invent it single-handedly, but he was key in compiling it, organizing it, popularizing it. This amazing monophonic chant, all in Latin, became the official music. It wasn't just background music, it was prayer itself, elevating the sacred text, creating this contemplative mood. So yeah, that period wasn't just about language, it was about locking down the form, the beauty of the prayer, structure, music, creating this harmony, this almost timeless feel that lasted over 1,000 years.
Wow, yeah, a synthesis of word and music designed to draw you in. So with this rich, standardized liturgy taking shape, you can understand why maybe centuries later, when challenges cropped up, the Church felt it had to defend it. And that brings us right to another massive moment, the Council of Trent, mid-16th century, 1545 to 1563. What was the backdrop there?
Well, the huge backdrop was the Protestant Reformation. Massive upheaval, theologically, liturgically, across Europe. And one specific issue the Church faced was lots of little modifications, variations that had sort of crept into the Latin Rite over the centuries. Some were okay, local customs maybe, but others, maybe not so much. And taken together, they kind of diluted the unity and theological precision the Church felt was vital. So Trent wasn't just about doctrine. It was very much about restoring order and reverence to the Mass itself. And it's from Trent that the Roman Rite, in this sort of defined, unified version, gets called Tridentine, right? And the effort didn't stop there. In 1570, Pope Pius V basically carrying out Trent's instructions, issues this apostolic constitution, Quo Primum. That's a papal bull, so serious authority behind it. And it declared the traditional Latin Mass the obligatory official rite for the whole Roman Church, with just a couple of exceptions, basically, really ancient rites that had been around continuously for at least 200 years. And Quo Primum really hammered home the importance of Latin as the Church's mother tongue for the Mass. It stressed how this rite, essentially unchanged for ages, had fed countless saints, helped the Church grow.
Okay, so connecting the dots. This was a massive push for preservation, for unity, kind of shoring up tradition against all that religious turmoil, making sure there was this consistent, revered way of worship right across the Latin Church. And that lasted, didn't it? That form held for what, over 400 years? Remarkable stability.
Incredible stability, yes. It really was a spiritual anchor for centuries. But then, the 20th century, it brought its own massive shifts. The mid-century church was grappling with modernity, this real desire for renewal, for aggiornamento. And that led directly to the Second Vatican Council, kicking off in 1962. One of its major documents, Sacrosanctum Concilium, specifically called for liturgical reform. The goals were greater clarity, more active participation from the laity, adapting to modern spiritual needs. And those reforms led to a pretty big overhaul of the Roman Missal. Bit by bit, vernacular languages, local languages were allowed, then became widespread, replacing Latin. Then in 1969 came the Mass of Pope Paul VI. We usually call it the Novus Ordo, the New Order. And that quickly became the form most Catholics know today in the West. Lots of changes came with it, priesthood facing the people, more focus on the liturgy of the word, simpler rubrics. But here's a key point, and epistles.online really stresses this. Even with all these reforms, even with the Novus Ordo becoming dominant, the traditional Latin Mass didn't just vanish, it kept being celebrated by people who, out of deep conviction, felt this fidelity to what they saw as the unchanging sacred deposit of faith. They felt called to keep that older form alive. And that just raises this huge question, doesn't it? How do tradition and reform live together? What happens to people when liturgy changes so much, but they feel deeply tied to the older ways?
That is the question, isn't it? And it's still echoing today very loudly. And it seems there's this ongoing sort of pastoral awareness, a recognition of the needs of those attached to the older rite. Our source details how popes tried to accommodate them. John Paul II, for example, he took some big steps. In 1984, there was this special permission, an indult, called Quatur Abinc Annos. It basically allowed bishops to permit the 1962 Missal for specific groups. Then just a few years later, 1988, he issued Ecclesia Dei. That's a motu proprio, so on his own initiative. And it really urged bishops to be, ample and generous in using that permission. The goals seem pretty clear: foster understanding, make sure those folks could still celebrate the TLM. And Pope Benedict XVI built on that in 2007 with his motu proprio Summorum Pontificum. That went even further, really. It stressed the continuity of liturgical tradition, said the old Mass was never actually formally canceled, abrogated, and made celebrating it freer. These felt like real attempts to bridge a gap, pastorally.
They certainly were significant efforts, aimed at unity, but also respecting those deep spiritual needs tied to the TLM. But as you know, the path took another pretty sharp turn very recently. 2021. Pope Francis issues his motu proprio Traditionis Custodes, and this document brought in what many people, including our source, call painful restrictions on using the traditional Latin Mass. It explicitly superseded, canceled out, those earlier permissions from John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Pope Francis was direct about his reasoning. He wrote in Desideravi, paragraph 61, something like, "The Church cannot return to the old ritual prior to the 1970 Missal, which the Fathers of Vatican Council under the Holy Spirit felt the need to reform," unquote. So, a major shift. Tighter controls, needing specific bishop approval, limits on where it could happen. Now, this is where epistles.online offers a really interesting kind of critical perspective on the bigger picture. He observes that maybe paradoxically, the way the Novus Ordo Mass is often celebrated today, well, it risks actually deepening what he calls this crisis of faith, especially belief in the real presence. He's careful to say the Novus Ordo rite itself is valid, but argues its common implementations, sometimes feeling more focused on the community, maybe less on God directly, maybe less silence, maybe a less sacred feel around the altar, sometimes a bit casual. He thinks this can obscure the Mass's sacrificial nature and Christ's actual presence in the Eucharist. So you get this tension, right? Trying to maintain liturgical unity on one hand, but potentially impacting this core belief for the faithful on the other.
Wow, yeah. It's incredibly complex and, like you said, really sensitive for a lot of people. When you just step back and look at that whole history we've sketched, from the late 2nd century, that Greek to Latin shift, through Trent in the 16th century, codifying it, and its, sometimes rocky, continued presence now. That's over 1,800 years. Just the sheer longevity says something profound, doesn't it? About its power, its reverence, how it's nourished generations of Catholics. And the epistles.online source points out, look, only God really has the reset button for these big shifts. And maybe a full, immediate return to the TLM everywhere seems unlikely right now, given what he sees as this deep crisis of faith sort of embedded in Catholic culture globally, a crisis that's maybe broader than just liturgy, touching on doctrine in the sense of the sacred itself. But he really emphasizes a call to action. He thinks it's vital we keep encouraging Catholics to rediscover reverence in all worship and celebrate even small steps, small sign of progress in respecting the sacred. So what's the takeaway? I guess this dive shows us faith and liturgy are always dynamic, always moving.
But that core need for reverence, for spiritual food, for encountering Christ's presence, that's constant, that's paramount. Yeah, this has given us a lot to chew on, hasn't it? We've covered so much ground: the ancient roots, the shift to Latin, Trent standardization, modern reforms, recent restrictions. Its whole history really shouts about its role in, well, nurturing souls, forming saints for centuries. It really does underscore how important it is to value this incredibly rich liturgical history and to hold on to the traditions that have kept the faith strong, but also keeping that concern about the crisis of faith, the need for reverence right at the forefront, like epistles.online highlights. This conversation definitely doesn't end here. There's so much more to explore, and please do continue your own learning journey. Visit www.epistles.online. You'll get the full context, the author's unique perspective, like we said, not modernist, not ultra-traditionalist, but really tackling those challenges to the faith head-on. Clericalism, liberalism, modernism, all the things he sees eroding faith today. You can find all the details there and see how to support his work.
Definitely. It really shows how liturgy is just woven into the fabric of the church's life, isn't it? And the life of every member. And the mission at Epistles Online is to keep that conversation going, keep resources freely available. You can help support that. Mission prayers are huge. Sharing posts helps, subscribing to. And of course, we'd love for you to subscribe to the Catholic Epistles podcast on whatever platform you use so you don't miss future deep dives. You know, thinking about everything we've discussed, especially drawing on our source, it does leave us with a big question, maybe for each of us personally. In this world that's always changing and given the spiritual challenges the church is facing, what's our part? What's our individual responsibility when it comes to preserving the sacred, cultivating reverence, and truly understanding how much our liturgical heritage shapes our spiritual lives? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope to have you with us for the next one.